At 11:58 p.m., somewhere over the central Arabian Sea, at 42,000 feet, two aircraft that did not appear on any civilian radar network, and whose existence in that particular patch of sky was known to fewer than 60 people on Earth, were making 410 knots on a heading of 312 degrees. They had been airborne for 16 hours and 41 minutes. They had refueled twice from KC-135 tankers operating on classified flight profiles over the Indian Ocean. The aerial refueling conducted in radio silence using pre-coordinated rendezvous geometry, the tanker crews told only that they were supporting a classified strategic mission and nothing further. The two aircraft, B-2A Spirit stealth bombers, call signs classified, tail numbers painted over for this mission with a different identifier that would never appear in any database a foreign intelligence service could access, carried in their rotary weapons bays a loadout that had never before been employed against a live target in a real combat operation. Not because the weapons did not exist. They had existed for over a decade. Not because the targets did not exist. The targets had been precisely characterized for years, because the decision to use them had required a calculus that democracies make slowly, and that this one had been making, with increasing urgency, for the better part of 3 weeks. The weapons were GBU-57A/B Massive Ordnance Penetrators. Each one weighed 30,000 pounds. Each one carried a warhead designed not to produce a large explosion in the open air, but to physically drive, through the mechanism of extreme kinetic energy and a fuse delayed to activate deep inside a structure, through the hardened overhead protection of deeply buried facilities before detonating in the cavity below. 30,000 pounds, 60 feet long. A penetrating fuse designed to delay detonation until the weapon has passed through concrete and rock of a depth that the program's engineers measured in meters rather than inches. Each B-2 carried 2 of them. 4 weapons in total. 4 weapons aimed at one target, the Fordow fuel enrichment plant, buried under 280 feet of solid granite mountain in the Qom governorate of central Iran, a facility that the Iranian government had constructed in secret, revealed only when Western intelligence agencies confronted Tehran with satellite imagery showing the tunnel entrances in 2009, and that had spent the subsequent 17 years hardening itself against exactly the kind of attack that was, at 11:58 p.m., 16 hours and 41 minutes into its delivery. Fordow had been built to survive. That was not a rhetorical assertion. It was an engineering objective that had driven every design decision in the facility's construction. The tunnel complex sat beneath 280 feet of the Zagros mountain range's western foothills, granite rock of a density that the Iranian engineers had specifically selected after studying the blast physics of American bunker-busting munitions. The facility's access tunnels were designed with multiple right-angle turns that would dissipate blast wave pressure from a near-miss surface impact. The air handling, power generation, and communications infrastructure that sustained the facility's operations were all hardened and distributed, so that the destruction of one element would not immediately cripple the whole. Iranian Defense Ministry assessments, leaked to Western intelligence services through back channels that both sides understood served a deterrent purpose, had consistently assessed Fordow as survivable against any conventional munition in the American arsenal. The assessment had been accurate. For a decade, it had been accurate. The GBU-28 bunker buster, the weapon that had been the American military's deepest penetrating conventional munition for most of that period, had a penetration depth against concrete of approximately 20 feet. Against granite, less. 280 feet of granite was not a targeting problem that the GBU-28 could solve. The Iranians knew this. They had done the math. The math had given them confidence. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator had been developed specifically because of that confidence. The The program, initiated in the mid-2000s, had as its explicit design objective the capability to defeat deeply buried and hardened facilities that existing munitions could not reach. The weapon's penetrating depth against rock, not concrete, not soil, rock, was classified. What is known from the physics of the weapon and from limited official statements is that it substantially exceeds the penetration capability of any previous American bunker-busting munition. The Iranian Defense Ministry's leaked assessments of Fordow's survivability had been produced before the GBU-57 reached operational maturity. They had not been updated since, because updating them honestly would have required acknowledging that the conclusion had changed. At 12:04 a.m., the two B-2s crossed into Iranian airspace at altitude. There was no alarm. There was no radar track. The B-2A's low observable design produces a radar cross-section that is measured in fractions of a square meter, smaller than a large bird at the frequencies most air defense radars operate at, invisible at others. The Iranian air defense network that had been severely degraded over the preceding 3 weeks of Operation Epic Fury was not, at this point, a coherent architecture in the conventional sense. The long-range early warning radars that might have detected even a stealthy platform through sheer aperture had been addressed in the campaign's first 72 hours. The medium-range fire control radars that would have been needed to engage a target at the B-2's operating altitude were either destroyed or operating in passive mode to avoid providing an emissions target to the HARM missiles that continued to patrol the outer edges of Iranian airspace on standby from the EA-18G Growlers orbiting over the Gulf. The integrated air defense system that Iran had spent 20 years building was, at the moment the B-2S crossed its border, a collection of isolated, degraded, communications-severed nodes that could see fragments of the sky above them and nothing coherent beyond their own sensor range. The B-2s did not know this with certainty. They flew as though every Iranian radar was fully operational. They flew the terrain-optimized routing that their mission planners had spent 72 hours constructing, a flight path that placed mountain ridgelines between the aircraft and every known radar site along the approach corridor, that minimized the angular exposure to any single ground-based sensor, that exploited the specific geometry of the Zagros mountain terrain to keep the B-2S in radar shadow for the maximum possible fraction of the approach. It was not a flight path that a human navigator would plan intuitively. It was the output of a targeting computer that had ingested 347 separate radar site locations, their coverage patterns, their operating frequencies, and their terrain masking profiles, and had solved for the minimum detection probability corridor through all of them simultaneously. The corridor existed. It was narrow. The B-2s flew it with the precision that their navigation systems, GPS-updated, inertial-backed, accurate to within meters, could deliver. At 12:31 a.m., the lead B-2 reached its weapons release point. The targeting solution for the first GBU-57 had been constructed over a period of 6 weeks using a combination of synthetic aperture radar imagery, signals intelligence from sensors that had been collecting against the Fordow facility for years, seismic analysis of the facility's underground layout derived from the acoustic signature of its ventilation and power systems, and human intelligence that had provided specific coordinates for the facility's Centrifuge Hall, the heart of the enrichment operation, the room that needed to be reached if the mission was to achieve its objective. The coordinates had been verified against 3 independent sources. The targeting package had been reviewed at the highest levels. The release point had been selected to place the weapon on a near-vertical terminal trajectory that maximized its impact velocity and therefore its penetration depth. The first GBU-57 left the B-2's weapons bay at 12:31 a.m. and 6 seconds. 30,000 pounds of steel, explosive and guidance electronics dropped away from the aircraft and began its fall toward the mountain below. The weapon does not have rocket propulsion. It falls. What gives it its penetrating power is not thrust, but velocity. The accumulated kinetic energy of 30,000 pounds falling from altitude, guided to a precise impact point by GPS and inertial navigation, arriving at the surface at a speed that allows the hardened steel, penetrating case to physically displace the material it passes through rather than being stopped by it. The fuse is designed to count the deceleration pulses as the weapon passes through successive layers of material and to trigger detonation when the count indicates that the weapon has reached the depth and location where it can do the most damage. It is not a smart weapon in the modern sense of a weapon with autonomous targeting. It is a precisely guided version of a very old idea: mass, velocity, and depth. The first GBU-57 impacted the mountain above the Fordow facility at 12:31 a.m. and 41 seconds. The impact was not silent. It was not subtle. The seismic signature of a 30,000-pound penetrating weapon striking granite at terminal velocity and detonating at depth is, by any measure, an event. Monitoring networks across the Middle East registered it as a 2.4 magnitude seismic event, centered at the coordinates of the Fordow mountain at 12:31 a.m. and 43 seconds. 2 seconds between impact and detonation, 2 seconds of the weapon driving through rock, decelerating at a rate the fuse was counting, until the count said, "Here." In Tehran, 340 kilometers to the north, the seismic monitoring station operated by the country's geological survey registered the event at 12:31 a.m. and 46 seconds, the 3-second delay representing the travel time of the seismic wave through the crust. The duty seismologist noted the signature in the log. It did not resemble an earthquake. The waveform of a deeply buried detonation has a characteristic shape, an impulsive initial arrival followed by a specific decay curve that trained analysts distinguish from tectonic events. The seismologist reached for the telephone. What she would eventually report upward through the chain of notification would be one of the clearest and most thoroughly documented seismic records of a weapon's employment in the history of her discipline. She had no way of knowing that yet. At 12:31 a.m., she knew only that something had detonated inside the mountain at Fordow, and that the yield, estimated from the seismic amplitude, was consistent with a very large conventional weapon. The second weapon released at 12:31 a.m. and 52 seconds, 46 seconds after the first. The interval was deliberate. The first weapon's penetrating path through the rock had created a channel, not a clean tunnel, but a zone of fractured, weakened material along the weapon's trajectory. The second weapon, released on nearly the same impact point, would travel through material that was already compromised, achieving greater penetration depth before detonating. This was the technique that the targeting engineers called progressive defeat, using the first weapon to prepare the path for the second. The second, GBU-57, impacted at 12:32 a.m. and 37 seconds. The seismic signature was 2.7 magnitude. Deeper. The channel the first weapon had created had allowed the second to go further. In the facility below the mountain, what the personnel inside experienced in the seconds after the first impact was not an explosion in the conventional sense of a pressure wave and a fireball. It was the ground moving. The transmitted shock of a detonation at depth travels through rock as a compression wave, a sudden, violent displacement of the material that propagates outward from the detonation point and arrives at the facility's structures as a force applied simultaneously from every direction. The Centrifuge Hall's structural elements, designed to withstand the static load of the mountain above and the routine vibration of thousands of spinning centrifuge rotors, were not designed for this. The first detonation's transmitted shockwave arrived at the Centrifuge Hall as a fraction of a second of applied force that exceeded the structural design parameters by a factor that the engineers who built the facility had calculated correctly could not be achieved by any weapon in the American arsenal. They had not calculated it for the GBU-57. The second detonation arrived at a deeper point, closer to the Centrifuge Hall's overhead protection layer. The transmitted shock from the second weapon was stronger than the first at the facility level. The second B-2 released its two GBU-57s at 12:33 a.m. and 12:34 a.m., targeting the facility's secondary enrichment chambers and the hardened power generation and air handling infrastructure that the facility's designers had distributed throughout the complex to prevent exactly what was now happening to the Centrifuge Hall. The third weapon's seismic signature registered 2.6 magnitude. The fourth, which reached a point in the facility's power generation infrastructure complex, registered 2.9, the deepest penetration of the four, achieved because the third weapon had further prepared the path through the progressive defeat sequence. At 12:35 a.m., the weapon's employment phase was complete. The two B-2s turned southeast and began their long transit home. Neither aircraft had been engaged. Neither aircraft had been detected with confidence by any Iranian air defense system. The mission had taken 31 minutes of Iranian airspace transit and 4 minutes of weapons employment. The aircraft would land at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri 40 hours later, having circumnavigated an appreciable fraction of the globe. What was left of the Fordow fuel enrichment plant was assessed over the following 72 hours. Through a combination of seismic analysis, signals intelligence indicating the cessation of the electromagnetic signatures associated with centrifuge operation, overhead imagery showing subsidence and surface deformation at the mountain's summit, consistent with large-scale underground structural collapse, and human intelligence from sources whose access to the facility's operational status was direct and whose reporting arrived through channels that had been reliable for years. The assessment was completed at 3:44 a.m. on the second day. The language was technical and precise. In plain terms, it stated that the Fordow fuel enrichment plant had been rendered inoperable, not damaged, not degraded. The Centrifuge Hall, which had contained at the time of the strike an estimated 1,440 centrifuges enriching uranium to the weapon's relevant levels that had been the specific provocation for the operation, was assessed as structurally collapsed. The power generation complex was non-functional. The air handling infrastructure that kept the underground environment survivable for human occupancy had failed. The facility that Iran had spent 17 years hardening against American conventional munitions had been defeated by 4 weapons that had not existed when the hardening program was designed. The IAEA monitoring equipment that had been installed at Fordow as part of the inspection protocols that Iran had intermittently permitted and intermittently revoked over the previous decade stopped transmitting at 12:32 a.m., consistent with a loss of facility power at that time. The agency's duty officers in Vienna, noting the loss of signal from the monitoring array, filed an internal report at 1:07 a.m. The report noted that the signal interruption could indicate a power failure, an equipment malfunction, or a physical event affecting the facility. The timeline of the signal loss, when cross-referenced with the seismic data from monitoring networks across the region, produced a picture whose interpretation required no sophisticated analysis. The monitoring equipment had stopped transmitting because the facility it was monitoring had ceased to exist in any operational sense. The IAEA's formal determination that the Fordow facility had been rendered inoperable and that its enrichment function had been terminated was published 6 days later, following a review process that was, given the clarity of the available evidence, largely procedural. Iran's nuclear enrichment program had operated across multiple facilities. Natanz, the primary enrichment site, had been addressed in earlier phases of the campaign. The Fordow strike was not the beginning of the end of Iranian enrichment capability. It was the end of the end. The specific contribution of Fordow to the remaining Iranian enrichment capacity, assessed by U.S. and IAEA analysts as representing approximately 31% of the remaining operational centrifuge inventory after the Natanz strikes, had been removed. The combined effect of the campaign's progressive destruction of Iranian enrichment infrastructure was, In the assessment language, a setback of a decade or more to Iran's ability to produce weapons-grade material at the scale and pace that had represented the core strategic concern. The GBU-57 had been built for one specific target set. Its operational debut, the first time the weapon had been employed against a hardened facility outside of testing, had been against the hardest target in that set. The weapon had performed within the parameters of its design. It had done the thing it was built to do. That sounds simple. It is not simple. The development of a weapon that can drive 30,000 pounds of steel through 280 feet of granite, detonate at the correct depth, and transmit enough energy to the facility below to render it inoperable without producing a surface explosion that would scatter radioactive material across a civilian landscape. That is not a simple engineering achievement. It is the product of a decade of classified research of physics and metallurgy and fuse design and testing against scale models and full-scale test articles in the Nevada desert. The weapon existed because someone, years before the mission that launched from Whiteman Air Force Base on this night, had understood that deterrence built on a facility that conventional weapons could not reach was not deterrence. It was an invitation.
The invitation had been accepted.
At 7:15 a.m., President Donald Trump posted a brief message to his social media platform confirming that American forces had conducted a successful strike against the Fordow nuclear facility and that the facility had been rendered inoperable. The post contained 4 words that were not in any intelligence assessment or battle damage report. The facility, he wrote, was gone forever, never again. The language was his own. The assessment behind it was the work of hundreds of people across the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, and the national laboratories whose entire professional lives had been spent understanding what it would take to remove from the world the specific threat that Fordow represented. The 60 people who had known about the mission before it launched had become, by morning, a number that was still climbing as the post-strike briefings moved through the chain of command and the Allied intelligence-sharing networks. Every one of those people had access to the same seismic data, the same signals intelligence showing the cessation of centrifuge signatures, the same imagery showing the surface deformation at the mountain's summit. The picture was unambiguous, regardless of which dataset you started from. The facility was gone. The enrichment was stopped. The weapon had worked. The mountain above the Zagros foothills still stood. The rock was still there. The tunnels that led into the mountain were still there, their concrete portals intact, their blast doors closed. What was no longer there, beneath 280 feet of granite that had spent 17 years being the argument against the possibility of this moment, was the facility that the tunnels had been built to protect. The mountain was a mountain again. The enrichment program that it had sheltered was history. In the mathematics of deterrence, the hardest lesson is always the one that arrives through the roof.